For 3 years, Morgan Vance had perfected the art of being invisible. At St. Aurora Medical Center, she was the float nurse nobody remembered. She covered sick calls, cleaned isolation rooms, stocked supply carts, and quietly disappeared at the end of every shift. The doctors barely noticed her. The nurses treated her like temporary help. To everyone around her, she was just another overworked employee trying to survive another day. That was exactly how Morgan wanted it, because 3 years earlier, she had been someone else. 3 years earlier, men had trusted her with their lives. 3 years earlier, she carried a call sign that echoed across battlefields. Raven, a name she had buried beneath blue scrubs, sleepless nights, and silence. But the past has a way of finding people who try to outrun it. On a grey Tuesday afternoon, while Morgan stocked masks outside an isolation room, she felt a vibration travel through the concrete floor beneath her feet. Nobody else noticed. The patients kept talking. The monitors kept beeping. The staff kept working. But Morgan knew that vibration. Her stomach tightened instantly. Helicopters. Military helicopters. Not one, several. The sound grew louder. Closer. Closer. Then the emergency phone rang. The one that almost never rang. The charge nurse answered. Within seconds, the colour drained from her face. Outside, 3 Black Hawk helicopters descended toward the hospital. The emergency department erupted into chaos. Doctors ran, nurses shouted. Equipment crashed against walls. And then the doors exploded open. A team of heavily armed special operations soldiers stormed inside, carrying a dying man. Blood dripped from the stretcher. The wounded soldier's chest rose in ragged gasps. His life was slipping away. The hospital staff rushed forward. The soldiers stopped them. Their commander scanned the room desperately. Then he shouted a single name, a name Morgan had not heard in years. "Where is Raven?" The entire room fell silent. Morgan's blood turned cold, because Raven was her. And if she stepped forward, the life she had spent 3 years building would disappear forever. But if she stayed hidden, a man would die. At 5:30 every morning, Morgan Vance woke before her alarm. Not because she was disciplined, because she rarely slept. The nightmares usually arrived around 3 o'clock. Sometimes she dreamed of helicopters falling from the sky. Sometimes she dreamed of blood-soaked sand. Sometimes she dreamed of faces she couldn't save. Tonight had been worse. A young soldier had reached toward her through smoke and fire. She knew his face. She always knew his face. But every time she tried to reach him, darkness swallowed him whole. Morgan sat upright in bed, breathing hard. Her small apartment was silent. The digital clock glowed red beside her bed. 5:31 a.m. Another night, another battle she had lost. Slowly she rubbed the scar along her left knee. The old injury ached whenever rain was coming. The weather forecast had predicted storms. Her knee agreed. By 6:30 she was driving toward St. Aurora Medical Center in a 15-year-old sedan that rattled every time she hit a pothole. The hospital came into view just as the sun climbed over the city skyline. Morgan parked in the employee lot and walked toward the entrance. Nobody greeted her. Nobody waved. Nobody noticed. Perfect. Inside, the smell of disinfectant and stale coffee filled the hallways. The day shift had already begun. At the clinical operations desk, Gloria Mercer barely looked up from her tablet. "Morgan." "Morning." "ICU is short 2 nurses. Oncology needs help after lunch, and ER lost another staff member." Morgan nodded. "Okay." No questions, no complaints. That was how float nurses survived. They went wherever the hospital needed them. Gloria finally looked up. "You understand you're not assigned to trauma cases, right?" Morgan felt a familiar sting. "Understood. Leave the advanced procedures to the specialists." Morgan simply nodded. If Gloria only knew. For the next several hours, Morgan moved through the hospital like a ghost. She helped an elderly patient eat breakfast. She comforted a frightened woman awaiting test results. She changed linens, delivered medications, answered call lights. The small, invisible tasks that kept a hospital functioning. Most people never noticed. Morgan preferred it that way. Near noon, she found herself sitting beside an aging veteran recovering from heart surgery. The man stared silently out the window. No visitors, no flowers, no family. Morgan sat beside him for a few minutes. "You served?" he asked quietly. She froze. "A long time ago." The veteran smiled. "Me too." For a moment, neither spoke. Then he nodded toward her eyes. "You still carry it." Morgan looked away. The veteran wasn't talking about military service. He was talking about grief, about memories, about ghosts. When she finally stood to leave, the old man spoke again. "Whatever happened over there," he said softly, "don't spend your whole life running from it." Morgan forced a smile, but the words followed her down the hallway, because she knew something the veteran didn't. Some ghosts never stopped chasing, and sooner or later, they always caught up. The rest of the afternoon passed the same way most of Morgan Vance's days did, quietly. Invisible, forgotten. By 1 o'clock, she was helping in oncology. By 2, she was covering a lunch break in pediatrics. By 3, she was back in the critical response wing, pushing a supply cart through crowded hallways while doctors hurried past without making eye contact. Nobody remembered where she had started her shift. Nobody cared where she would end it. Morgan preferred it that way. At least that's what she kept telling herself. As she passed through the waiting area, she noticed a familiar figure sitting alone near the vending machines. A homeless man named Curtis. He had been discharged that morning after treatment for pneumonia. The hospital had cleared him medically. But outside, freezing rain had started falling. Curtis sat staring at the floor. No jacket, no food, no place to go. Morgan stopped beside him. "You waiting for someone?" she asked. Curtis laughed bitterly. "Nobody waits for me." The answer didn't surprise her. She glanced toward the cafeteria. 5 minutes later, she returned carrying a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a cup of hot coffee. Curtis looked up in confusion. "You don't have to do that." Morgan placed the food beside him. "I know." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Curtis smiled. It was small, fragile, but genuine. The kind of smile people gave when someone reminded them they still mattered. Morgan walked away before he could thank her. She wasn't looking for gratitude. She understood what it felt like to be forgotten. Back inside the ER, chaos was building. A multi-vehicle accident had flooded the department with patients. Monitors beeped, phones rang, stretchers rolled through hallways. Dr. Ethan Cole looked overwhelmed. The young resident was standing over an elderly woman whose blood pressure was dropping rapidly. Sweat covered his forehead. His hands shook as he attempted another IV insertion. Missed. Again, the woman winced. Ethan cursed under his breath. Several nurses noticed. Nobody stepped in. Morgan watched from across the room. She recognized the signs immediately. The resident wasn't incompetent. He was scared. Fear made people rush. Rushing caused mistakes, and mistakes killed people. Morgan approached slowly. "I can help." Ethan looked up. His pride flared instantly. "I've got it." Morgan didn't argue. She simply studied the patient's hands. Paper-thin veins, severe dehydration, limited options. She reached into the supply tray and selected a much smaller catheter. Ethan frowned. "That won't hold enough flow." "It will hold more flow than no IV at all." For a second, he hesitated. Then he stepped aside. Morgan gently stabilized the woman's hand. One smooth motion, the catheter slid perfectly into place. Blood flashed. The line held. The monitor stabilized minutes later as fluids began running. Relief washed across Ethan's face. "You used to work trauma?" he asked. Morgan secured the tape. A long time ago. Where? She met his eyes for the briefest moment. Far away. Then she turned and walked off before he could ask another question. Behind her, Ethan stared after her. For the first time, he wasn't seeing a float nurse. He was seeing someone who knew things she shouldn't know. Someone carrying experience that didn't belong in ordinary hospital hallways. As Morgan disappeared around the corner, she felt his gaze lingering. The attention made her uncomfortable, dangerously uncomfortable, because every question brought people closer to the truth. And the truth was something she had spent 3 years burying. Unfortunately for Morgan Vance, the past was already beginning to dig itself back out. That night, Morgan barely made it home before the rain started. Dark clouds rolled across the city skyline, swallowing the last traces of sunlight. By the time she parked outside her apartment building, thunder was rumbling in the distance. Her knee hurt. That usually meant the weather was changing, or her memories were. Sometimes she couldn't tell the difference. Inside her apartment, the silence felt heavy. There were no photographs on the walls, no family pictures, no military memorabilia, no reminders of who she used to be. Morgan had spent 3 years erasing Raven from existence. One room, one box, one memory at a time. She microwaved a frozen dinner she wasn't hungry for and sat alone at the kitchen table. The television remained off. The apartment remained silent. Her eyes drifted toward a locked drawer in the corner. For several seconds she stared at it. Then she looked away. She hadn't opened that drawer in months. Around midnight, she finally crawled into bed. Sleep came quickly. Peace did not. The dream began the same way it always did. Rotor blades, gunfire, sand, heat. Then screaming. Northern Syria, 4 years earlier. Morgan wasn't Morgan there. She was Raven, combat medic. Call sign Echo 7. The woman everyone called when someone was dying. The woman who never panicked. The woman who always found a way. At least that's what everyone believed. The dream carried her back to the mission, back to the night everything changed. She could see the convoy moving through a narrow valley. Moonlight reflected off armored vehicles. Radio chatter filled the air. Mason Rourke sat across from her, checking equipment. Caleb Stryker was joking with another operator. Everyone looked relaxed, confident, alive. Then the explosion came. A flash of white. A deafening blast. The lead vehicle disappeared in fire. The world erupted. Machine gun fire tore through the darkness. Men screamed. Morgan was already moving. Training took over. She dragged wounded soldiers behind cover, applied tourniquets, started won verses, stopped bleeding, saved lives. The chaos lasted minutes. It felt like years. Then she found him, the soldier from her nightmares. A young operator named Tyler Grant, 23 years old, newly married, good man, good soldier. He had been hit by shrapnel. Badly, too badly. Morgan dropped beside him. Blood soaked her gloves instantly. Tyler looked at her. Fear filled his eyes. "Don't let me die," he whispered. Morgan worked desperately. Chest seals, pressure dressings, airway management, everything. Everything she knew, everything she had ever learned. But some injuries were simply too severe. Tyler's pulse weakened, then weakened again. Morgan kept fighting, refusing to quit, refusing to accept reality. Morgan. His voice was barely audible. Not Raven, not Echo 7. Morgan, the name from before the war, the name nobody used anymore. Then his eyes closed and never opened again. The dream shifted. Suddenly she was standing beside the helicopter, carrying his body home. The rotor wash blasted hot air across her face. Mason stood nearby, silent. Caleb stood nearby, silent. No one blamed her. That made it worse, because Morgan blamed herself enough for everyone. The dream shattered. Morgan bolted upright in bed. Her chest heaved. Sweat soaked her shirt. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. Again, always 3:17. The exact time Tyler died. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and buried her face in her hands. For years she had told herself she left the military because she was tired, because she was injured, because she wanted peace. Those were lies. The truth was much simpler. She had left because she couldn't forgive herself. Outside, thunder rattled the windows. Inside, Morgan sat alone in the darkness. The ghosts had returned, and for the first time in years, they felt closer than ever. Somewhere far away, beyond the storm clouds and sleeping city, the distant sound of helicopter rotors seemed to echo through her memory. Morgan closed her eyes. She had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, those sounds would become real again. And when they did, everything she had worked so hard to bury would come crashing back into her life. The next morning began like every other shift. Morgan arrived at St. Aurora Medical Center 15 minutes early. The sky was grey. Rain still dripped from the edges of the parking structure. Her knee hurt worse than usual. Not enough to slow her down, just enough to remind her that some wounds never truly healed. Inside the hospital, the familiar rhythm of organized chaos had already begun. Phones rang. Monitors beeped. Doctors hurried through hallways clutching charts. Patients filled nearly every bed. Morgan spent most of the morning doing what she always did, helping, cleaning, disappearing. Around noon, she was assigned to restock an isolation cart near the far end of the critical response wing. The task required almost no thought. Boxes of gloves, face shields, N95 masks, disposable gowns. Simple, predictable. Safe, exactly the kind of work she preferred. Morgan was counting respirators when she suddenly froze. Something felt wrong. At first, she couldn't identify it. A faint vibration, barely noticeable, almost impossible to hear over the noise of the hospital. But she felt it, not in her ears, in her teeth. Her jaw tightened. Slowly, she looked up. The vibration came again, low, rhythmic, heavy. Thump, thump, thump. Her pulse instantly accelerated. No, the word escaped before she realized she had spoken. A nurse walking past glanced at her. "You okay?" Morgan forced a smile. Fine, but she wasn't, because she knew that sound. Every nerve in her body knew that sound. Civilian helicopters sounded different. Medical evacuation aircraft sounded different. News helicopters sounded different. This sound belonged to something else entirely. Military rotor blades. Large military rotor blades. Morgan set down the box she was holding. The vibration strengthened. Closer now, much closer. Memories rushed forward without permission. Hot desert wind, dust storms, burning fuel, the smell of blood inside cargo bays, the desperate race against death. Her breathing became shallow. Across the department, nobody seemed to notice. Dr. Ethan Cole was discussing lab results. Gloria Mercer was arguing with a supply representative on the phone. Patients watched television. Life continued normally. Only Morgan seemed aware that something unusual was approaching. Then the emergency phone rang. The red phone, the one reserved for major incidents. The entire nurses' station went quiet. Gloria frowned. She slowly picked up the receiver. "Critical response wing, this is Gloria." Morgan watched the color drain from her face. "What do you mean they're landing here?" Several nurses looked up. Gloria's voice became louder. "No, that's impossible. We're not cleared for military trauma operations." Silence. Then Gloria swallowed hard. "How many casualties?" More silence. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God." The phone slipped slightly in her hand. Every conversation in the department stopped. Doctors exchanged nervous looks. Patients stared. Morgan already knew. She could feel the answer in her bones. Outside, the vibration became a roar. Windows trembled. Ceiling tiles rattled. Several people rushed toward the nearest window. One nurse gasped. 3 dark helicopters emerged through the clouds. Black Hawks, flying low, flying fast, flying directly toward the hospital. The first aircraft crossed over the parking structure. The second followed seconds later. The third appeared behind them. Morgan's stomach dropped. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm, too familiar, because she had seen this before, many times. And Black Hawks never arrived carrying good news. Never. The roar grew deafening. Dust swirled outside. Car alarms began sounding in the parking lot. Security personnel ran toward the emergency entrance. Inside the hospital, panic spread rapidly. Nobody understood what was happening, except Morgan. She knew exactly what military helicopters meant. Someone was dying, someone important, and somewhere deep inside her chest, a terrible feeling began to grow, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. The feeling that her carefully hidden past was racing toward her at 200 miles per hour, and it was almost here. The first Black Hawk touched down in the hospital parking lot with enough force to shake the entire building. Dust exploded into the air. Rainwater swirled across the asphalt. The deafening roar of rotor blades drowned out every other sound. Inside St. Aurora Medical Center, people rushed toward windows, despite repeated warnings from security. Nobody had ever seen anything like this. Morgan stood perfectly still. Her heart pounded. Not from fear, from recognition. This was military urgency, the kind that only appeared when seconds mattered, the kind that usually arrived carrying death. The second helicopter landed, then the third. Within moments, heavily armed operators jumped from the aircraft. They moved with terrifying speed. No hesitation, no wasted motion. Morgan recognized the posture instantly. Special operations. The best. And if they were here, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The emergency entrance doors burst open. The operators stormed inside, carrying a blood-soaked stretcher. Everything changed. Conversations stopped. Monitors continued beeping, but nobody seemed to hear them. The entire department froze. The wounded man lying on the stretcher looked barely alive. His uniform was shredded. Blood covered nearly every inch of his body. His left leg ended above the knee, beneath a crude battlefield tourniquet. A chest wound bubbled with every ragged breath. Pink foam stained his tactical vest. His lips were turning blue. Morgan's stomach tightened. Tension, pneumothorax, severe blood loss, respiratory collapse. The man wasn't dying. He was seconds away from death. "Move!" one of the operators shouted. The command echoed through the department. Doctors scrambled aside. Nurses backed away. The soldiers pushed directly toward Trauma Suite Alpha. Dr. Victor Langford stepped forward. "I'm the attending physician." The operator leading the team barely looked at him. "We don't have time. You need to tell us what happened. We need a surgeon. You need to save him." The operator's voice carried an edge that silenced everyone nearby. Dr. Langford glanced toward the patient. His expression changed immediately. He understood. This was beyond routine trauma care. Way beyond. "Get blood ready," he shouted. "Activate emergency surgery. Move!" Staff members scattered. The wounded operator suddenly convulsed. A horrible choking sound escaped his throat. The cardiac monitor, attached by one of the flight medics, screamed. Heart rate falling. Oxygen saturation dropping. Blood pressure crashing. The room erupted into panic. Dr. Ethan Cole hurried forward. Several nurses followed. The operators blocked them instantly. "Back up. We are trying to help." "Then find Raven." The words stopped everyone. Morgan felt her pulse stumble. "Number." "Not that. Not here." The operator scanned the room. His eyes moved across frightened nurses, across doctors, across security personnel, searching, desperate. Morgan immediately looked away. She lowered her head, focused on the floor. Invisible. Be invisible. The wounded soldier arched violently. Blood spilled from his chest dressing. The monitor alarm accelerated. One of the medics looked up. Pure panic filled his face. "We're losing him!" The leader turned slowly. Morgan recognized him instantly. Even old, even harder, but unmistakable. Mason Rourke. For 4 years she had hoped never to see him again. Now he stood less than 20 feet away, covered in dirt, covered in blood, covered in desperation. Mason searched the room one final time. Then he roared with enough force to silence the entire emergency department. "Where is Raven?" The words hit Morgan like an explosion. Every memory, every nightmare, every buried secret returned at once. Silence swallowed the room. Nobody moved. Nobody understood. Nobody except Morgan. Because Raven wasn't a medic. Raven wasn't a legend. Raven wasn't a ghost from some distant war. Raven was her. And as she stared at the dying man on the stretcher, Morgan realized something horrifying. If she stayed hidden, Caleb Stryker would be dead within minutes. But if she stepped forward, the life she had spent 3 years building would end right here, right now. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of St. Aurora Medical Center, for the moment, Morgan couldn't move. The world seemed to slow around her. The alarms, the shouting, the rotor blades outside, everything became distant, muted, like she was underwater. Across the trauma room, Caleb Stryker fought for every breath. His chest rose unevenly. Blood soaked through layer after layer of field dressings. The blue tint around his lips was deepening. His body was running out of time. Morgan knew the signs. She had seen them hundreds of times before, sometimes on mountainsides, sometimes inside helicopters, sometimes under enemy fire. The outcome was always the same. Without immediate intervention, Caleb would die. Mason's voice echoed through the room again. "Where is Raven?" Nobody answered. Nobody knew. Morgan closed her eyes. 3 years. 3 years spent hiding. 3 years spent convincing herself that Raven no longer existed. 3 years spent pretending she was ordinary. Then Caleb suddenly stopped breathing. The monitor screamed. A terrified flight medic looked up. "His SATs are crashing. 42%. Another medic cursed. "We're losing him." The room erupted. Doctors shouted conflicting orders. Nurses rushed in different directions. Someone dropped a tray of instruments. Metal crashed across the floor. Morgan looked at Caleb. Then she looked at Mason. Their eyes met. Recognition exploded across his face. Not because he recognized her appearance. Time had changed both of them, but he recognized something else. The look, the focus, the calm, the absolute refusal to panic. The same look she had worn on every battlefield. Mason whispered only one word. "Raven." Morgan exhaled slowly. The decision was made. She stepped forward. Everything changed. The frightened float nurse disappeared. The combat medic returned. Her voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "Everybody shut up." Silence. Instant. Total. Doctors stopped talking. Nurses froze. Even the operators went still. Morgan moved toward Caleb's stretcher. Fast. Focused. Cold. She assessed him in seconds. Collapsed lung. Massive blood loss. Airway compromise, possible internal bleeding. The situation was catastrophic, but not hopeless. Not yet. She pointed at Dr. Ethan Cole. "You, get me a large bore catheter." Then at another nurse. "Blood warmer. Now." Another. "Chest tube tray." The nurse hesitated. Morgan turned toward her. The intensity in her eyes erased every argument before it could form. "Move." The nurse ran. Dr. Victor Langford stared at her, confused, stunned. "Who exactly are you?" Morgan didn't even look at him. Not important. Her attention never left Caleb. His breathing had become a weak rattle. Every second mattered. The monitor alarm continued screaming, heart rate falling, oxygen dropping, life slipping away. Morgan leaned over the stretcher. For a brief moment, she saw another face. Tyler Grant, the soldier she couldn't save, the soldier from her nightmares. Pain stabbed through her chest. Not today. Not again. She pushed the memory aside. Focused, present, alive. Caleb's life depended on it. Mason stepped beside her. For the first time since entering the hospital, hope appeared in his eyes. You can save him? Morgan studied the wound, calculated, measured, decided. Then she nodded. I can try. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't emotional. They were simply honest. Because combat medicine taught one brutal lesson. Nobody promised survival. You fought for it. 1 second at a time. The supplies arrived. Morgan grabbed them without hesitation. The room watched in stunned silence. Nobody questioned her anymore. Nobody challenged her authority, because somehow everyone understood the truth. The quiet woman they had ignored for 3 years was the most dangerous medical professional in the building. Not dangerous because she carried weapons. Dangerous because she had spent years standing between death and the people it wanted to claim. Morgan pulled on fresh gloves. The smell of blood filled the room. The monitor screamed again. Caleb's oxygen saturation dropped even lower. 38%. 35. Time was gone. Morgan looked at the chest wound, then at the instruments, then back at Caleb. Her expression hardened. Raven was fully awake now, and death had just made the mistake of challenging her one more time. The battle for Caleb Stryker's life was about to begin. The trauma room held its breath. Nobody moved unless Morgan told them to. Nobody spoke unless it was necessary. The panic that had consumed the department only moments earlier had been replaced by something else. Focus. Caleb Stryker's condition continued to deteriorate. The monitor flashed warning after warning. His oxygen levels remained dangerously low. His pulse was weak. Every second mattered. Morgan forced herself to ignore the noise, the alarms, the questions, the fear. She concentrated on what she could control, one step at a time, one decision at a time. That was how people survived impossible situations. Dr. Ethan Cole stood beside her, holding equipment with trembling hands. What do you need? Morgan glanced up. Steady hands and clear thinking. Ethan swallowed and nodded. For the first time all day, he stopped trying to prove himself. He simply listened. Across the room, Mason stood near Caleb's shoulder. His face revealed nothing, but Morgan knew him. She could see the worry in his eyes. This wasn't just another operator. This was family, the kind forged through years of danger and sacrifice. Morgan checked Caleb's breathing again, not improving fast enough. She adjusted the treatment plan immediately. Stay with me, Caleb, she said quietly. The words surprised her. She hadn't meant to say them aloud, but suddenly she wasn't speaking to the wounded soldier in front of her. She was speaking to every person she had ever fought to save. Every life balanced on the edge. Every promise she had tried to keep. The room seemed to narrow. Time slowed. Morgan's world became a series of small details. A heartbeat, a breath, a reading on a monitor. Gradually, those details began to change. The oxygen level stopped falling. Then it rose, slowly, painfully slowly. But it rose. 36, 38, 42. Dr. Ethan stared at the screen. It's working. Morgan didn't answer. Not yet. She had learned long ago that hope could be dangerous. You celebrated after the crisis, never during it. Another minute passed. Then another. Caleb's breathing became more regular. His pulse strengthened. Color slowly returned to his face. The room began breathing again. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else wiped tears from their eyes. Even Dr. Victor Langford looked stunned. He had spent decades in emergency medicine, yet he had never witnessed someone take control of a collapsing situation with such calm certainty. Finally, Morgan stepped back. Exhaustion hit her, all at once. Her shoulders ached. Her hands trembled slightly. The adrenaline was fading. Mason looked from Caleb to Morgan. Is he going to make it? Morgan studied the monitor one final time. The numbers were stabilizing. The immediate danger was passing. For the first time since the helicopters landed, she allowed herself a small breath of relief. He has a chance. The words hung in the room. A chance. Not a guarantee, but a chance. And sometimes, in Morgan's experience, a chance was the most valuable gift anyone could give. As the surgical team prepared to take Caleb upstairs, the people around her stared in disbelief. The float nurse they barely noticed had just saved a man's life. And for the first time, everyone in the room wanted the answer to the same question. Who exactly was Morgan Vance? The moment Caleb Stryker was wheeled towards surgery, the tension inside the critical response wing changed. The emergency was over. The questions were just beginning. Morgan felt them immediately. Eyes followed her wherever she moved. Doctors, nurses, technicians, even security personnel. Nobody was looking at her the way they had that morning. The invisible float nurse had disappeared. Now everyone saw something else, something they didn't understand. Morgan hated it. She turned away from the trauma room and began cleaning equipment. It gave her hands something to do, something to focus on. Unfortunately, it didn't stop the whispers. Did you see what she did? Who is she? How did she know exactly what to do? I thought she was just a float nurse. The comments followed her through the hallway. Each one made her shoulders tighten a little more. At the nurses' station, Gloria Mercer looked completely shaken. For years, she had assigned Morgan the least important jobs in the hospital. Now she couldn't stop staring. Finally, Gloria approached Morgan. Morgan continued organizing supplies. What? Gloria hesitated. A rare event. She was not a woman known for uncertainty. You never told anyone? Morgan looked up. Told anyone what? That you're... Gloria struggled to find the words. A combat medic? The sentence landed heavily. Several nearby staff members immediately stopped pretending not to listen. Morgan sighed. It never seemed relevant. Gloria blinked. Relevant? The woman had just saved a life under conditions that would have overwhelmed most trauma teams. Relevant was an understatement. Before she could respond, Dr. Ethan Cole appeared. He looked almost embarrassed. You trained with special operations? Morgan nodded once. Ethan laughed softly, a disbelieving laugh. I spent 6 months thinking I was teaching you things. Morgan almost smiled. Technically, you were. That answer confused him even more. Across the room, conversations erupted as more information spread. The special operations operators weren't helping. Several of them openly referred to Morgan as Raven. Others spoke about missions, combat deployments, medical evacuations, things ordinary hospital staff rarely heard outside movies. One of the flight medics accidentally made things even worse. She's a legend. The statement traveled through the department in seconds. Morgan closed her eyes. Wonderful. Exactly what she didn't need. By late afternoon, administration became involved. Hospital executives arrived. Questions followed. Requests followed. Paperwork followed. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted explanations. Everyone wanted details. Morgan wanted silence. As the attention grew, the walls seemed to close around her. The bright lights felt harsher. The noise felt louder. The memories felt closer. Finally, she slipped away. Nobody noticed at first. She walked down a side hallway, past supply rooms, past storage closets, past the break room, until she reached the utility sanitation room. The moment the door closed behind her, she exhaled. The room smelled like bleach and disinfectant, strangely comforting. Nobody expected heroes to hide in rooms like this. Morgan leaned against the sink. Her hands trembled. Not from fear, from exhaustion, the emotional kind, the kind that arrived after years of carrying something heavy. She stared at her reflection. The woman in the mirror didn't look like Raven. She looked tired, older, worn down, human. For 3 years she had built a new identity, a quieter one, a safer one. Yet in less than an hour, that identity had cracked apart. Everyone knew now. Everyone had seen. The ghost was gone. And the person waiting outside that door wasn't Morgan the float nurse anymore. It was Raven, whether she wanted that title back or not. A knock echoed against the door, slow, deliberate. Morgan already knew who it was. There was only one person in the building who knocked like that, Mason Rourke, and judging by the weight in her chest, the conversation waiting on the other side was one she had been avoiding for years. The knock came again. Slow, patient, certain. Morgan stared at the door for several seconds before finally speaking. "Come in." The door opened quietly. Mason Rourke stepped inside. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The small sanitation room suddenly felt too crowded, too full of memories. Mason closed the door behind him. The sounds of the hospital faded. Only silence remained. Morgan crossed her arms. "You always were terrible at giving people space." A faint smile touched Mason's face. "You always were terrible at hiding." That earned him the first genuine eye roll she had given anyone in years. The brief moment of humor disappeared almost immediately. Reality returned. Heavy, uncomfortable, necessary. Mason leaned against the wall. His uniform was still stained with Caleb's blood. The sight brought back memories Morgan had spent years trying to bury. Battlefields, helicopters, friends, funerals, loss. "You disappeared," Mason said quietly. Morgan looked away. "I retired." "No." His voice remained calm. "You vanished." The difference hit harder than she expected, because he was right. She hadn't retired. She hadn't moved on. She had run. Morgan stared at the sink. The fluorescent light reflected off the steel surface. Cold, clinical, safe, unlike the conversation happening behind her. Finally, she sighed. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth." Morgan laughed bitterly. "The truth?" She turned toward him. Her eyes glistened, not with tears, with years of exhaustion. "The truth is, Tyler died." The room fell silent. Mason didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't correct her. He simply listened. "The truth is, he looked at me and asked me not to let him die." Her voice trembled. "The truth is, I failed." "Morgan, I failed." The words exploded from her, years of guilt pouring out all at once. "I did everything right." Her breathing became uneven. "I followed every protocol. I made every decision correctly. I gave him everything I had." Her voice cracked. "And he still died." Silence. For years she had carried those words. For years they had poisoned every attempt at happiness, every attempt at peace, every attempt at forgiveness. Mason looked at her carefully. Then he asked a question she wasn't prepared for. "How many people did you save?" Morgan frowned. "What? How many?" She didn't answer. Mason continued. 50? 100? 200? The numbers felt meaningless. He stepped closer. "I lost count after 300. Morgan stared at him. Mason's voice remained steady. "You remember Tyler because he died. You forgot everyone else because they lived." The words hit harder than any accusation ever could, because somewhere deep inside she knew he was right. She remembered every failure, every loss, every funeral, but she never remembered the people who went home, the ones who survived, the ones who got a second chance. Mason reached into a cargo pocket. For a moment, Morgan thought he was retrieving paperwork. Instead, he pulled out a small fabric patch, worn, faded, old. The embroidered raven was barely visible. Morgan's breath caught instantly. She recognized it. Her old unit patch, her call sign, her history, her family. Mason placed it gently on the sink. "I found this after you left." Morgan stared at it. The patch seemed impossibly small, yet somehow it carried years of memories, years of pain, years of sacrifice, years of people she loved. Mason looked at her. "You know what Caleb said before surgery?" Morgan slowly shook her head. A faint smile appeared on Mason's face. He asked if Raven made it in time. Morgan swallowed hard. He remembered? He never forgot. The room became very quiet. For years, Morgan had believed she was running from failure. Now she realized something else. She had also been running from love, from loyalty, from people who never blamed her, people who never stopped respecting her, people who never stopped caring. Mason moved toward the door. Before opening it, he paused. Tyler wouldn't want this. Morgan looked up. What? The hiding, the self-punishment, the guilt, the loneliness. Mason's eyes softened. You carried everyone else's pain for years. He nodded toward the patch. Maybe it's time you stopped carrying it alone. Then he opened the door and left. Morgan remained standing beside the sink, alone, silent, staring at the faded raven stitched into the old patch. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had never accepted before. Maybe Tyler's death wasn't the only thing her past had left behind. Maybe it had also left behind something worth keeping. And maybe, just maybe, Raven didn't have to be a ghost anymore. Morgan remained alone in the utility sanitation room for several minutes after Mason left. The old raven patch sat quietly on the sink, a simple piece of fabric. Yet it felt heavier than anything she had carried in years. Slowly, she picked it up. Her thumb brushed across the faded stitching. Memories surfaced immediately. Laughter around campfires, long nights inside helicopters, friends who became family, voices she hadn't heard in years. Some were still alive, some were not. For the first time, those memories didn't feel like enemies. They felt like reminders, proof that her life had mattered, proof that Tyler's sacrifice and the sacrifices of so many others had meant something. Morgan carefully folded the patch and slipped it into her scrub pocket. Then she took a deep breath and opened the door. The hospital corridor stretched before her. Bright, busy, ordinary, and somehow completely different. As she walked back toward the critical response wing, she noticed the helicopters were gone. The parking lot outside had returned to normal. The storm clouds were beginning to break apart. Sunlight pushed through the grey sky. The crisis was over, but the consequences remained. The moment Morgan stepped into the department, conversations stopped. Again, dozens of eyes turned toward her. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, administrators, even patients. Nobody knew exactly what to say. Nobody knew how to act around her anymore. To them, she was no longer the quiet float nurse. She was the woman who had walked into chaos and taken command. The woman special operations soldiers trusted with their lives. The woman who had saved Caleb Stryker when everyone else thought he was already lost. Hospital administrator Rebecca Holt approached first. She offered a professional smile. "Morgan, we'd like to discuss today's incident." Morgan nodded politely. "I'm sure you would. There will probably be media inquiries." Morgan nodded again. "There probably will. We'd also like to review your military background." Morgan considered the request for a moment. Then she surprised everyone. "No." Rebecca blinked. "I'm sorry?" "No." Morgan smiled gently. "I appreciate the interest, but I came here to work." The administrator looked completely confused. "That's it?" Morgan shrugged. "What else is there?" Rebecca had no answer, because there wasn't one. The attention, the recognition, the admiration, none of it mattered to Morgan anymore, not the way it once might have. Across the room, Dr. Ethan Cole approached. Unlike earlier, there was no uncertainty in his eyes, only respect. "You saved his life." Morgan shook her head. "The surgical team will save his life. You know what I mean." She did, but she still refused to accept the praise. Before Ethan could continue, Gloria Mercer appeared. The charge nurse looked more uncomfortable than Morgan had ever seen her. For several awkward seconds, she simply stood there. Finally, she spoke. "I owe you an apology." The entire nurses' station fell silent. Gloria Mercer almost never apologized. Morgan waited. "I misjudged you." Gloria's voice was sincere. "I thought you were avoiding responsibility." She laughed nervously. "Turns out you were carrying more responsibility than most of us could imagine." Morgan looked at the woman who had spent years assigning her the least desirable jobs in the hospital. Then she smiled. Not a forced smile, a genuine one. "We all carry things people can't see." Gloria nodded. For the first time, they understood one another. The moment passed. The department slowly returned to work. Phones began ringing again. Patients needed medication. Monitors beeped. Life moved forward. Morgan walked toward the isolation cart near Bay 3, the same cart she had been stocking when the Black Hawks arrived. Half the masks were still scattered across the shelves, a small reminder of where everything had started. She picked up a box and began organizing supplies, one by one, slowly, methodically, comfortably. The work felt familiar, grounding, real. Several people continued watching her, waiting, expecting something dramatic. Some grand speech, some emotional declaration. Instead, Morgan simply finished stocking the cart. A few moments later, Gloria approached again. "The administration team is still waiting." Morgan closed the drawer. Without looking up, she answered in the same calm voice she had used all morning. "Tell them I'm on my break." Gloria stared. Morgan adjusted another stack of masks. "And when I get back, someone needs to clean Trauma Suite Alpha." A faint smile appeared on Gloria's face. "You don't want to do it yourself?" Morgan finally looked up. A playful spark appeared in her eyes, the first many people had ever seen. "I don't do the heavy lifting." Several nearby nurses laughed. Even the Ethan smiled. Morgan returned to organizing supplies. Then she delivered the line that would become legendary inside St. Aurora Medical Center. "I just float." This time, everyone understood what she meant. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't trying to erase Raven. Morgan Vance could be both. A healer, a survivor, a woman carrying scars and strength in equal measure. And as the afternoon sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, she realized something she had not felt in years: peace. Not because the past was gone, but because she had finally stopped fighting it. For the first time since Tyler's death, Raven had come home.